Hello and welcome to the Digital Forensics and Incident Response Lecture. My name is Dr. Owen Redwood, and this lecture is part of the Offensive Computer Security 2.0 OpenCourseWare, hosted by hackallthethings.com. This lecture is broken into two parts. The first part is new lecture material, and the second part is old video. The first part, we cover how to understand incidents, describe them, identifying incidents, and incident response. And so we'll cover indicators of compromise, as well as the phases of incident response, including preparation and planning, and how to build a solid incident response team. And part of that, we will talk about a list of extremely useful digital forensics and incident response tools that are used in professional settings. Part 2 will cover a demo of Volatility, and so it'll go through analyzing a memory dump of an infected system with Volatility, carving out processes, analyzing those processes with IDA, identifying indicators of compromise and identifying some signatures, and then how to write YARA rules with a given signature so you can streamline the identification of that attack in the rest of your systems. An incident responds to a security breach or attack in general. So this may be denial of service attack, it may be data leaks, it may be confidential information that's marked, it may be personally identifiable information, intellectual property, it may be trade secrets. An incident may involve sabotage, data corruption, system damage, hardware damage. It may be standard malware like CryptoLocker or other common malware families that are being seen these days. An incident response is an organized approach to addressing and remediating the aftermath of a security breach or an attack. The goals are simply to limit the damage of the incident, to limit the recovery time, and to limit the costs incurred by the incident. The common challenges in the general case are going to be, for an organization, its budgets, your resources, limited personnel, because you're not going to have the best team in place when an attack happens. People may be on vacation or they may be out of work otherwise. Bureaucracy and shareholders and stakeholders are also another common challenge in big organizations as well as small organizations, and we will discuss that in a little bit. To build a proper incident response team, the following roles should be filled by one or more people. Incident coordinator. That is someone who keeps track of everything, addresses the expectations of the bosses, as well as the impacted individuals or groups, as well as the customers, and then understands the bureaucracy and understands the laws and regulations of your industry. So if it's medical industry, it's HIPAA, and etc. So the coordinator keeps track of the whole incident response. But another person, or there's another role to fill, and that is the incident manager. It may be the same person as the coordinator if someone has sufficiently strong management skills, but this is someone who has strong social skills, knows the bosses, knows the subject matter experts in the company, as well as outside of the company, third parties that they can rely on to come in under contract to respond quickly to serious enough incidents that are beyond the capabilities of an organization, which theoretically could happen to any organization. And then you have the incident responders themselves, which there should be several, and they should be capable in their skill set. They should be very well informed. They should keep up with the technical developments in the field, and they should be technically skilled. You should be able to sit them down in an interview and have them do their job for things that are quick enough to do. Subject matter experts are sometimes third-party consultants, because usually your budget does not allow you to keep the super talented people on a incident response or security team full-time. And so you should have a list of consultants that you can rely on, that you can call upon. And then you should have someone on the incident response team that I've heard referred to as Zeus or Thor or whoever. Someone who can get anything done. who has ultimate authority and can threaten to fire people if they do not comply with your request to resolve the incident. And so they can move the bureaucratic mountains and oceans, and they may be some form of executive or stakeholder at a similar level. So executive might be the CISO or CTO, and they have the right to fire people in the general case. At the end of the day, the keys to effective incident response all lie at clear leadership. You have to have a clear division of responsibilities and authorities. So these roles that I've just described have to be very clear. There can be no confusion in the middle of a crisis as to who is doing what and who is looking into what. You need to have beforehand established plan and processes. You should know your entire network map, and you should know your systems inside and out, and be able to respond to incidents in the general case for any part of your network according to your plan. And if you don't have that much, if you're bringing in a third-party team, that only increases the cost of responding to the incident, because now they have to learn the whole network. They have to figure out what goes where and how things work. Another key to effective incident response is keeping morale up. No one's going to have a perfect analysis of the aftermath, and everyone's always learning from mistakes in this field. Everyone, good guys and bad guys. And finally, the final key to effective incident response is addressing the stakeholders' expectations and keeping them in the loop and informed. Incident responders who ask good questions are a key part of the team. And finally, any plan that you have should not be public. For some reason, people put these things on Google Docs or other places that are external and third party, and this is an absolutely inappropriate place to store incident response plans. Some tips for dealing with stakeholders effectively is that they're going to be impatient at the end of the day. No one likes hearing bad news, and when they want it resolved quickly. They're not going to understand the situation and the technical challenges that your incident response team may face, and they may not understand the technical details of the attack and the impact. They may not even understand the policy and business impacts of the attack, or let alone the impacts of the attack with regards to state and federal laws and regulations. If you are tasked with protecting certain types of information, such as medical information, that may have to be explained to some of the stakeholders. Stakeholders at the end of the day may take efforts to micromanage your team, and that can make things worse. And they can also slow things down, and you're going to have in large enough organizations teams that if your incident response takes long enough, you may be cutting into their business operations and their ability to turn profit and keep the bottom line. And so they may slow things down by delaying cooperation with you. So that's why, at the end of the day, having some Zeus-level authority who can crack the whip and get things done promptly is going to be key to an effective incident response team. There are some nuances of the incident response process that we have to go over first. Record keeping is key throughout start to finish of the process, from logging the first indicators of compromise and logging what you've looked at, how and where is going to be absolutely essential. This information should not be stored on external systems. It should not be stored in Google Docs or other public resources. Attackers, when they're targeting personally identifiable information or similar stuff, a lot of your incident response record keeping can reflect some of that information. So if you have trade secrets in the attack traffic that they're exfiltrating, keeping the records of that should not be outside of your network. And it should also be kept on a need-to-know basis because it possibly contains sensitive information that you haven't analyzed yet. There's going to be a period until you identify what was impacted and how that you're not going to know what the actual extent of the damage was to the system. So you should treat it always as a worst-case scenario in terms of keeping the information private and protected. You also have to do a thorough job of recording any of the mistakes that the team made. And this is not not to use this against the team in any way or fashion. It's simply just to involve into the planning process so you can learn from any mistakes and have a quicker response and more accurate response next time. And you should understand the attackers aren't telling you what they did. There's no chessboard in front of you. You don't see the moves that led you to this current disaster. The mistakes you're going to make are going to be a natural process. In fact, in incident response, mistakes are very common in the response process. And it's going to keep you up all night. There's going to be a lot of 4 a.m. decisions where you're fueled by nothing but coffee, snacks, and everyone's exhausted. And at the end of the day, the reason all of this record keeping is key is because usually law enforcement gets involved and there's a chain of custody on evidence. And then you have to do it all with that in mind, that some of this may have to stand up in the court of law in terms of forensic evidence if you ever manage to attribute the attack. Say if it's credit cards and they find the culprit using credit cards and they arrest them, that's going to have to stand up all in court. But in many cases, attribution is not possible with cybercrime. So this is a graphic from NIST on incident response and the life cycle of incident response. And stage 0, as many people say, is what's going on all the time. Should be preparation. It should have a plan. You should have these teams and resources and processes in place. You should have some meetings discussing, like, okay, if X got hacked, our most important database, if X got hacked, how do we respond, blah blah blah. And so once the impact happens, once there is a sufficient indicator of compromise that it seems like you have been breached, you then go into the incident response active mode, which is kind of a circular loop of detection and analysis. And then once you detect something, you go into containment, eradication, and recovery, or otherwise known as triage and remediation. And once you've identified that the incident is over, has been remediated, you then have a post-incident review and debriefing and evaluate what mistakes you made that could be fixed next time for the preparation phase and how you can streamline any of your process. So these are old slides, but to reiterate, stage 0 is preparation. That's where you're establishing an incident response plan and team. Stage 1 is once an attack has been detected, detection and triage, and that's where localization of payloads and malware throughout the system occurs, and you identify the mortally wounded systems and focus and triage them off and focus on the ones that you can save, that need to be saved, and prioritize based off business impact. Stage 2 is containment. Once you've localized systems, you want to localize threats on systems. You want to then characterize them. So this can be kind of a long-term process, but in the short term, you want to scramble to understand the problem and communicate quickly what is known. The goal is to really get to the point where the incident is no longer a direct threat, where you can limit the scope of the incident to its current impact and stop the bleeding infection and stop the spread throughout your network and business. It's important during this phase to communicate to the stakeholders any possible root causes. You don't have to have a definitive list. It can be a list of hypotheses. And you want to watch out for follow-up attacks during these remediation efforts. And step 3, remediation. It's easier said than done. Again, taking the systems offline is one of the first steps, and then characterizing what the problem is, what the threats are, is the next step, and then fixing it could be a very long process if there's a rootkit involved or a similar impact. Finally, after the resolution of the incident, there should be an after-action root cause analysis, incident response report, and the aftermath is aftermath may involve law enforcement, someone getting fired, or going to jail. So the average day-to-day for an incident responder is dealing with complaints and determining what is actually an incident. Some things are better suited for just IT tickets and forwarding along to technical support, but what is an indicator of something that requires a full-fledged incident response? There are often going to be false positives and false negatives in this process, and there's no perfect way of really determining, since attackers never announce when they're coming. A common standard terminology is indicator of compromise, and that is a forensic artifact or a remnant of an intrusion that can be identified on the host or on the network. And this is a artifact that is used to communicate threat intelligence among defenders, both inside your organization as well as with third-party entities like a CERT or other form of authority. It's going to depend in nature by the attack and the attacker. So it's going to drastically differ for insider threats versus outside hackers. It's also going to depend on the attack vector. It's going to, if it comes over the network, you may have captured some aspect of it in the network PCAPs or the network logs. Hopefully you keep them. But if it comes in over a malicious USB someone dropped off in the parking lot, it's going to take a long time to conclude that it actually was because of a USB. Here's some great examples. Ransomware hits you. It's very obvious. IDS alerts go off like crazy. There's a lot of strange traffic on the network, especially egress traffic to new foreign destinations. That should be especially concerning if their source IP is your intranet database servers. You have systems crashing all over the place. Another common example or situation is user machines are abnormally slow, which may not be an indicator of compromise. It may be an indicator of the latest patch from whoever's your OS vendor, Microsoft, Apple, or whatever, is really bad and it's causing everything to slow down. There are other straightforward indicators worth covering. Some threat actor dumps your corporate emails or dumps your internal documents on Pastebin or WikiLeaks. Your corporate secrets are now on WikiLeaks, or some audit reveals a massive amount of money or suspicious amount of money is unaccounted for. There are indirect ways to find out. You find out from the news. Maybe there's a whistleblower. It may not be legitimate, though. It may be some imposter set to dissuade your customers or ruin your reputation for security. But it also may be a leak of intellectual property, which happens all the time before big tech expos for, say, mobile vendors and tech companies. It may be a leak of an upcoming merger, and that has a lot of monetary value in terms of insider trading, which is illegal. And maybe a leak of quarterly performance and other performance reports. Now, indicators of compromise aren't just the initial indications that you may have an incident to deal with. They're all indicators throughout the entire incident response and investigation that point to potential compromise of an individual system or systems. So some other examples involve combinations of suspicious metadata on a host system plus some complex malicious code, say a DLL or exe that imports or exports a strange amount of functions or a strange list of functions, creation of suspicious registry keys or mutexes on Linux systems, PAX logs, any attempts that create seg faults, which is something that if you're doing incident response And if you have control over your organization's network and you have Linux systems, absolutely put PAX on these things, because PAX, with one of the default settings, it will log any seg faults, and it will show you exactly what PC is pointing at. So you'll be able to grep for PC space byte space at colon, and it will show you what the raw bytes are. And you can pipe that in many cases directly to object dump or something in a bash one-liner. And if it looks like a normal prologue, it's fine. But if it looks like shellcode, then you can see, like, right there that, hey, this is a strong indicator of compromise. And so we've covered a number of examples of indicators of compromise, and at the end of the day, they boil down to either their weak indicator or their very strong indicator. And so there have been efforts led by DHS and others and MITRE, notably, who you all should remember was responsible for standardizing the CVE format that hopefully you all are trying to get with your VLC fuzzing. Anyways, these organizations have been working to standardize indicators of compromise and their documentation and communication. And so the Incident Object Description Exchange format is at openioc.org, and there's an RFC on it. And there are communication standards that if you get into this profession, you will encounter, because depending on your field, US CERT, or if you're doing SCADA, ICS CERT, they're going to be using STIX and TAXI and Cybox. And so these are individual standards that all play together. And so TAXI stands for Trusted Automated Exchange of Indicator Information. That's a standard for establishing a trusted comms network for exchanging indicators of compromise inside your organization and also with third parties. Cybox stands for Cyber Observable Expression. STIX stands for Structured Threat Information Expression. And these both complement each other and can be used interchangeably in some situations. And so TAXI is a set of specifications for exchanging threat information with other organizations and inside your own organization. It does not go as far as establishing one monolithic or centralized information sharing program, and it doesn't come with any predefined default trust agreements that you may have to worry about. But towards that, it does require some setting up. So in setting it up, TAXI has 3 standard sharing models: hub and spoke, where there's one centralized clearinghouse; source and subscriber, or producer and subscriber, producer consumer, however you like to see it, where there's one organization as the source of the information and everyone else subscribes to their feeds, and you can have n number of feeds. And then there's finally peer-to-peer, where there's multiple informations consume each other's information and produce their own information. Now, the GitHub project for TAXI, which is at the link at the top, taxiproject.github.io, there's also a Python library that I think you can pip install, and it's libtaxi at the bottom. Anyways, inside the project currently there are 4 services, and each service is optional, and services can be combined in any number of ways. So there's an inbox service, which is just designed to receive pushed content. That's what you subscribe to things with, and subscribed information goes into your inbox. There's a poll, which is a service to request content, which pulls down content from a producer, a hub, if you will. There's a collection management service, which learns about and requests subscriptions to data collections. So that's where advertisements for hubs and sources can be found in. And then there's the discovery service, which will learn services and learn how to interact with them. Learn services that are already supported. Right now, all of the information in TAXI is basically in XML format, and it's required to be communicated over HTTPS. The Sidebox standard establishes a common structure for representing cyber observables, which are either going to be dynamic events or stateful properties. Some examples include packets, email messages, MD5 hashes for files or processes, URLs, domain names, or registry keys. This is designed for assisting with log management, malware characterization, indication sharing and incident response, and threat assessment. The link to the project is up at the top, cyboxproject.github.io. STIX is a language for standardizing the communication for representation of threat information. And to break it down, a single STIX structure covers the following objects. An observable is a dynamic event or stateful property that is represented in Cybox format. An indicator is an observable plus context. This context may include time range, information source, IDS flags or alerts, or etc. An incident is a set of adversary activity plus context. It may also include tactics, techniques, and procedures, and that should be self-explanatory by now. And the next object is the exploit target, which is formally defined as a weakness of a victim versus the tools, tactics, and procedures, but I would rather define it as the target of the observed exploitation at either a level of fidelity that communicates both the software service targeted as well as the operating system platform, and at the best case is identifying the versions for all of these as well. The course of action object, or otherwise COA, is any suggested defensive actions against the threat which involve both prevention, remediation, and mitigation. The campaign is a set of related TTPs, indicators, incidents, and exploit targets. The threat actor is any title given for the current cyber adversary. To imagine how these all fit together, STIX is simply the language that you can use Cybox words in, and this is all communicated over TAXII. So STIX characterizes and provides a common structure for what is being said, and TAXII defines how STIX is shared. For more information, see the securityintelligence.com blog, which is run by IBM. And this specific blog post really cleared things up for me because there's, of course, going to be a lot of overlap. For an example, with the existing tools, you can visually represent some of the observables in this fashion. And so we have threat actor and information on them. You may have TTPs, you may have other observables, and so on. This is probably going to be more useful for your upper level management because they like to see visuals. So in the process of characterizing the attack and responding to it and containing it, you probably want to consider some of the following actions. Fixing your firewall rules, fixing, especially probably the most effective action you can take on this list is fixing any of your egress rules. If you're allowing all ports and protocols to communicate out of your network over egress, that is a problem. You should have that locked down, especially if the network traffic of that given network is very well defined. And if you lock that down, you might be able to shut off the command and control of the given campaign, which is step number one in containing it. It can't be directed by a human actor to spread to other targets and to exfiltrate other assets. You should also fix any of your ingress rules and tighten those up. You're going to want to address any network weaknesses. Are any of your multi-home systems, say using LDAP or SOAP showing up in such a manner that defeats your NATs and your subnets. You're going to want to see if you can leak the IPs of multi-home systems from your subnets to see if you can reveal what the subnet IP for that multi-home system actually is behind its NAT. Next, you want to make sure the DNS can't be zone transferred and is locked down. Attackers, if they can see a DNS server can be told to zone transfer, can tell it to zone transfer and say, hey, I am now the master. Give me all your DNS records for your intranet network. And that is extremely useful in mapping a network for an attacker. You also want to address any network awareness gaps and make sure that you have sufficient situational awareness throughout your organization network. You're going to want to add malware signatures, probably in YARA format, which we'll show later in this video, to your IDS and antivirus. And you're going to, throughout the whole process, try to identify the full extent of the compromise and what assets were targeted. And you're going to keep in mind that all your documentation is going to be used for impact investigation, law enforcement reporting, customer and investor notification, which I've marked in red because they may be more serious for some cases. You're going to want to update your policies. Bring your own device, otherwise known as BYOD, is the bane of organizational and enterprise security, because they can go home, do whatever they want on these devices. You have no control of it, and they bring it to your networks and they connect them to the Wi-Fi, and any compromises they have on their systems are now being introduced behind your firewalls and within your networks. You also want to prohibit social media, YouTube, and Pandora on any critical systems. All of these platforms are being increasingly used to deliver malware, not directly through compromises of the systems, but through the advertisement ecosystems. Actually, just today, we caught some malicious advertisements going over the Pandora website, and Pandora has no way to be aware of these things. They're just trusting that their ad supplier is not distributing malicious content, and that's being increasingly exploited by attackers, this trust relationship. You're going to want to patch systems. You're going to want to sit down and train personnel to stop clicking on phishing emails and fake AV pop-ups if that was the point of intrusion. At the end of the day, after a proper incident response, you're going to have the damage contained, identified, and stopped. You're going to have documentation of the attack vector and TTPs, and hopefully the vector is patched, or you're working with the vendor and it's in process of being secured, and you have some mitigation in place, and you have some TTP signatures to detect later attacks from the same campaign. You are going to have an incident response report. That's very important. It's going to explain in detail the impact of the breach and proof of your analysis. It's going to have details of the scope and damage done. It's going to have details of the start and end of the breach, the time frame that you estimated it first began. Often when attacks are initiated against organizations, it takes them on average 6 to 8 months for them to even notice it. But it can go on for years. So this investigation is going to be important, because if they've been there for a very long time, they may come back again. They may be utilizing other backdoors that they never activated in your current incident. You're going to have documentation on how you addressed the incident, and you should have some figures for what funds from your incident response budget went towards this incident, what technical steps you chose, and so the IR budget is going to cost the personnel, the overtime, contractors you brought in, any services, third party that you had to enlist. The report is also going to have indicators of compromise and how it was fixed, some narrative summary of how it was fixed and what steps you need to take in the future, which may involve more penetration testing, which is proactive security, but it's only useful if you take the recommendations to heart and act on them, which too many organizations just get the pen test to check their compliance checkbox, but never do a damn thing with the report. And at the end of the day, you need to revisit your understanding of your risks. If assets were popped and you're not really aware of the impact, you need to now revisit your risks. You need to think about, okay, what is really the potential impact for this asset getting owned? Is there something we're missing? Is there something we missed when we architected this network? Do we need to revisit things and have better defense in depth? Too often, people just get the incident response report and get the pen testing report and be like, okay, that's great. Just keep it from happening again, but then don't take any action to do it by giving this need any budget or priority within the organization. And so if you've gotten to this point and your organization is looking at starting this whole process from scratch, and you don't have a SOC, you don't have an incident response team, you don't have a CSIRT, there's some resources I can recommend. The next lecture is going to cover some of this. But there's also two good talks. One is Building an Incident Response Program, and the link is provided here. And another one is 10 Strategies of a World-Class Cybersecurity Incident Response Team. CERT.org, which is Computer Emergency Response Team, run by MITRE, if I recall correctly. This is their guide, this link to building a CSIRT team and plan. And it's good standard advice. So now let's cover a somewhat comprehensive digital forensics and incident response toolkit that you're going to want to look at acquiring for a incident response team. So here we go. The master tool rundown for digital forensics and incident response in general. For network traffic analysis, you absolutely should have Wireshark, TCP flow, and maybe consider getting TCP extract. Other good tools are Network Miner, I've seen used a lot. NetWitness, the free version is still good enough. Explico, ENT, which is for file entropy and cryptanalysis, which can be used for looking at attachments on the wire that you extract from packets and stuff like that. Bro also has really good stuff for file carving for traffic analysis. And the Network Appliance Forensic Toolkit is a open source Python toolkit. It's pretty good. You should never be running Wireshark as root. There are hundreds of vulnerabilities in Wireshark and all of its packet dissectors. Again, it is trying to parse all the things, and I've said that before in this class. And so it's naturally going to have many more vulnerabilities in your standard application. So, for intrusion detection systems, Snort is pretty much industry standard for heuristic and signature-based intrusion detection. Suricata is a newer entry into the field, and Bro is a industry-recognized tool that's reliable. For registry and file system analysis, there are a number of very expensive tools in this category, but you can, in most cases, get by with still free open source stuff. Ncase is the big gorilla in the room. It costs tens of thousands of dollars per CD key, and it does a number of things really well, and is made for Windows network system admin and incident response and forensics work, and it has a comprehensive set of tools and features, but many of these features can be accomplished by short little Python scripts. The neat feature that Ncase does is allowing you to install endpoints on your organization systems and be able to do this all remotely. But again, SSH can facilitate that, and so yeah. The Sleuth Kit, which grew out of TCT, is a open source free kit for this work. Highly recommend it. It's just got a wide array of features. I've used it myself for CTFs, and I've got a lot of forensic flags with just the Sleuth Kit alone. Oh, that and Scalpel. Analyze MFT is for analyzing the main file table. If I recall correctly, that's what MFT stands for. And this can be used for looking for hidden files or file system tampering to obfuscate when files were created, when they were modified, who they're owned by, and other properties, which malware commonly tries to do in an attempt to hide from detection and analysis. And MFT Tools also does this as well. Reg Ripper is for Windows systems, is for extracting registry information and analyzing it. Bulk Extractor, also good for mass file system analysis. And Mandiant's Redline Tools, I think they have a free trial or they have a free version. Either way, I've heard a lot of good things about them, but I haven't used them myself. For log analysis, Splunk has a wonderful free version of their log analysis platform for situational awareness. It is just awesome. I use it myself. Log Viewer is also good. OSSec has a pretty good host-based intrusion detection system, and that works mostly off logs, so I'd call that log analysis as well. For file system integrity, pretty much there's been a lot of tools in this area, but they've fallen to the wayside in terms of being kept up to date. But the one that I see recommended the most is Sam Hain. For memory collection, which we'll show off in a little bit, there's FTK Imager, which is pretty much the most widely recommended imager, and you're going to need this tool for when you get to a system and you need a snapshot of it so you can analyze it later. So this is a very, very important tool in the evidence collection process and analysis process of incident response. Dump It is also widely recommended. Moonsouls is what I show off in a little bit. It's strictly for Windows. Let's see, for remote administration toolkits like SSH, I'd consider in this, and almost the whole Bash family of standard Linux tools. But Racket, or Remote Acquisition and Triage Tool, is a framework for collecting remote samples and images from systems. Ncase also does this, but that's a commercial tool. I believe Racket is free, so that's worth checking out if you're on a budget. Now for process and memory analysis, Volatility is perhaps the big tool in the room that most people use, and we'll show off a demo later. It's not an interactive tool in most use cases, except when you're dumping images and using Vol Shell to look at them interactively. But it's more of an open source community framework that a lot of people committed individual analysis tools to. Mandiant Redline is worth mentioning here. WinScope is a good one for Windows, but Volatility will work on Windows, Linux, and I think other operating systems. For file carving, now here's where there's a lot of crossover into embedded systems, reverse engineering, and hardware reverse engineering, at least for firmware and stuff like that. All those same tools are very useful for this category because you face some of the same obfuscation challenges in reverse engineering firmware. I digress. Scalpel, Binwalk, and Foremost are my go-to tools. Those three, they're all free, and I highly recommend them. I use Binwalk and Scalpel perhaps the most, and Foremost when the other two fail. And this is primarily for extracting hidden files or resources from a individual file, and it's just a great set of tools. PhotoRec is also very good for dealing with anything hidden inside of image files or steganography. There's also PDF tools and PDF Stream Dumper, which are very useful for identifying hidden files inside a PDF, which may be your what your attackers are using. For debuggers, it's going to depend on your operating system. So here we have GDB, Immunity, Ollie Debug, WinDebug, etc. For malware analysis sandbox, pretty much the most recommended I've seen is the free open source Cuckoo sandbox. Malwasm is one that's definitely it's a addition for it that's worth looking at, and it allows you to pause and rewind execution step by step. Uh, it requires a lot of resources to do this, but it allows for just incredible dynamic analysis capabilities for malware samples. For reverse engineering, there's IDA Pro. There's the new Binary Ninja, which is really great for x86 ARM, and they're adding other architectures, I believe. But that is one that was widely used in addition to IDA in the Cyber Grand Challenge. Trail of Bits put out a really great blog using it for Cyber Grand Challenge and CTF, and I think it was 1,000 cuts with Binary Ninja. But I digress. Hopper and Ollie are also good reverse engineering platforms. Now for mobile, this is where there's less entries in the market, but we can say that Oxygen Forensics, XRI, and Cellebrite's UFED seem to be the most suggested forensic toolkits for mobile systems, but I have not had the opportunity to use any of them. Now for general toolkits, these are the catch-alls that do 2 or more of these above categories. There's Autopsy, there's Kane, there's FTK, there's OS Forensics, there's DFF, there's OCFA, there's the SANS SIFT workstation, NCase Forensics, X-Ways Forensics, and Coffee. And so obtaining one or more of these will cover multiple categories, but you should at least try to have solutions for one of the above categories, if not more. I've tried to put together a pretty thorough list based off multiple advice blogs across the internet, and my own use and my own circle of friends, and asking them what they use most often or what tools they found to be extremely useful in certain incident responses. Volatility is a framework for extracting digital artifacts from RAM and memory dump samples, and it's extremely useful to have your systems on your network using virtual machines, but using just snapshot that stuff. You can even do it remotely. It's extremely convenient for incident response and security operations, and if you detect that it has been compromised, you can revert to a previous snapshot almost instantaneously compared to other forms of manual remediation. That's the great thing about virtual machines, is you can snapshot known good states and revert to them at a later date if you muck things up. So Volatility works for both 32-bit and 64-bit versions of Windows XP, 2003, Vista, 7, 8, and 10. It also has support for some Linux systems, if I recall correctly, and it has 2 interfaces. There's a single command line interface where you can only run a single command, and then there's the interactive vol shell, which allows you to run multiple commands in one instance, so you can do multiple passes of analysis, and it's extremely useful. But the problem with Volatility is you're scanning entire systems memory dump, not just one process in many cases. And so that, for a single analysis pass, is going to take quite some time. So I highly recommend that your incident response team that's using Volatility has really beefy systems that can handle loading 8, 12, 16 gig files into memory, or dealing with those. It's not going to load the whole thing into memory. It's going to load it into pages as on demand. But yeah, that'll really speed things up. So to get a memory dump for Volatility, if you don't have a virtual machine, one tool that I have used in the past is Moonsouls Memory Dump, and you can get that at moonsouls.com. And so a memory dump is a binary file. It's not going to have any standard file format. It may just be .bin if you're lucky. That contains the complete contents of system memory. So you're going to have the stack, the heap, you have all the memory segments, and that's going to be for the entire system across all processes, including the kernel and daemons and services. An example screenshot for Moon Souls is we use Win32DD, which is basically DD for Windows, and these are the typical outputs that you would see of it. It would give you the OS version and physical memory, give you some indicator of how much memory is actually in use. It won't. If you have 60 gigs of RAM, it's not going to write a file that's 60 gigs of RAM if it's not being 100% utilized. And it gives you all this diagnostics and then asks you yes or no whether or not you'd like to continue with the dump. And it'll take some time, and then it'll tell you when it's done, and it'll timestamp it for you, which is really nice. So let's take a quick look now that you understand like the process to get a memory dump, which is very simple. What type of commands you can run with Volatility. So Volatility is currently at 2.5, but they still recommend everyone uses the 2.4 edition documentation of their cheat sheet. So the cheat sheet has a number of resources on the left, and it goes over basic usage, and then it has 3 pages or more. Yeah, there's 5 pages now of commands that span various categories, and they now have Mac OS X support as well. So perhaps the most useful ones to start off would be the network ones to see what network information. So ConScan will scan the process dump for any active connections that are currently in memory at the time of the dump, as well as SockScan, because the malware may have rootkitted the system and may be manipulating the one table that ConScan analyzes. There's also NetScan, and you can look up also their browser history. So they have support for our Internet Explorer. I think there's modules for Firefox and Chrome, if I recall correctly. There should be. You can look up command scan and console history. You can look up event logs. There's specific ones to look for injected code, and malfind is something that looks for injected code blocks like DLL injection and stuff like that. And once you've identified something that has injected code in it, you can then do DLL list to see what it has imported, and you can see imp scan to see what artifacts of module imports are in the given process memory dump. Let's see. Registry, you can do Hive list. Also, you want to look for any form of hooking. API hooks is really good. That's going to catch many forms of keyloggers. You can dump the screen, the desktop, which is pretty awesome. And there are going to be some malware-specific scans that are going to just target specific malware campaigns, so like Zeus, Citadel, Poison Ivy, and Java Rat. So Zeus scan, Citadel scan, etc. Those are useful for that. You can basically look at the structure for those, because this is all open source, to see if it's something that you can make into a skeleton and build an individual scanner for any campaign that you're looking at. Otherwise, you can use YARA rules to do generic scans with Volatility for a given process memory dump or system memory dump, and that's how you can build identifiers and then share them, so you don't have to share some script that you've written for your Volatility. Instead, you can share the YARA rules, which can be used by Bro or something else. The cheat sheet has a number of general suggestions of activities and the commands and options that we would use to accomplish them. So you can check if a process has domain or enterprise admin level status, and it would be get SIDs, and then you grep for whether it's domain or enterprise. And this is worth going down and trying and seeing what your results are. And so you can see that it has Linux support, and it can dump process information. So it can do process map. You can list the open file descriptors, which is great because sometimes you can hide the sockets and connections, but it'll show up still as open file descriptors in some cases, depending on how they've done it. Let's see. There's other ones that I haven't covered yet that I know I've used. Let's see. Yeah, it's under process listing. So PS list is probably one of the first things you want to do. You also want to do PS scan to see if there's any hidden or terminated processes that are still hanging around in memory. PS tree is really useful. It'll show you a tree of all the processes running, the parent and child processes for each, in a nice ASCII tree format, and so you can see what spawned what. So if you see something service-based has spawned some other process that doesn't make sense in that context, that might be an indicator that it has been compromised. So that's worth keeping in mind. Anyways, let's get back to the lecture. So using volatility and a memory dump, you can analyze the process list, the thread list, each process's memory, all of the active connections, all of the sockets, all of the DLLs, all of the malware backdoors that are currently in memory, which may leave zero forensic evidence on disk, which is why memory analysis is very useful. And in general, if you're getting started with volatility, -H is for help, and -V is for verbose output. There are some nuances that are worth covering. Volatility will silently fail if you give it bad options, and this is a common problem through most of its community plugins. And you have to keep in mind that most of the options are community written plugins, so they fail in weird ways. They're not always going to work. They don't work for all versions of Windows, and in the general case, they just fail for IPv6 networks. And so that means scanning for connections that are IPv6 and sockets are going to be problematic with the existing tools. So process memory dumps and scanning them for malware backdoors will often trigger your antivirus system, which I've seen in practice, that if you use volatility to scan this and it's looking at this and your AV is going and it's looking at it at the same time, it's like, holy crap, this needs to be quarantined, and that can really be a pain. So the rest of this video is going to be original video from demo of volatility, IDA Pro, and Yara, looking at a system's dumped memory that has been compromised and identifying the compromised process, isolating its memory dump, looking at that individually, then looking at it with IDA, identifying some signatures for it, and then building Yara rules for it. I hope you enjoy.
So at home, this is a scenario that I basically ran. Through a vector I'm not going to tell yet, I exploited a victim, a Windows XP machine, and spawned an interpreter payload. I ran get system, then I spawned calculator.exe, then I migrated to calculator.exe. I could have migrated to explorer.exe to be more subtle, but this is just for the sake of demonstration. Then basically, a little bit after that point, I took a snapshot of the memory, and then this is where we're proceeding. So, given the snapshot, an easy, quick way to get started is to start off just with malfind. If malfind turns up results, it will dump if you tell it to, it will dump all the process images for any of the suspicious results, and you can begin analyzing them there. it won't name each process. Like this is calc.exe. It will say this is basically, it won't even say this is PID this. When you run PS list, it will tell you the PID, the address it's running at, and the size of the image. When malfind and procmemdump and these things dump these images, they address them by the address they start at and the size. And you have to basically go back to the process list and match this up. So malfind finds things based off VAD tag and page permissions, and it can't detect DLLs injected into a process using create remote thread, load this DLL. It's still very helpful, but like I said, it's not a silver bullet. So other things I mentioned are IDR modules, DLL list, and scan. So malfind is actually commonly used by incident responders. And here's an example of it using to find Zeus-related malware. And Zeus is basically a crime kit that you can buy for, I don't know how much money on the underground, but it is pretty common. So you can specify for malfind exactly what process to look at, and it'll tell you the relevant basically modules. So here, Zeus happened to infect basically by injecting a DLL into explorer.exe. So what I've prepared basically to demonstrate is how you would use volatility and these tools that we've shown so far through the class, how to do triage and containment, how to do response, basically resolution. So hopefully I can do this in 20 minutes. If the first thing you do is malfind, it may take a couple minutes, and it will dump basically on the console all the relevant information. So to tell it to dump to basically a file, you give it -D, and you tell it what directory to do. And so it dumps all the process images here. So some are just raw binary data, and if you try to open them up in like IDA, it's going to have no PE headers. It's just going to be raw binary data. And you may face like alignment issues with decoding the opcodes right. So you need to find basically the process entry point and be able to start from there. And that's a pain. However, many times it will actually dump a valid PE with PE headers. Some of the tables may be stripped, like the IAT tables. So going through those and opening them up one by one, you can quickly, with something like IDA, figure out, okay, what's suspicious, what's not. And from also the console output, you can generally correspond what process is what. So at the end of iterating through this, I found something actually really, really interesting, and it happened to be in calc.exe. I found these strings called priv_password_get SAM hashes and priv elevate get system. Why would calculator or any program actually need those two strings? So I did some more investigation. They're stored in the R data, so not stored actually in the .text or anything like that. And we have all these other strings stored in the R data. And at almost right away, that should tell you something's going on. It's just either a malicious version of calc.exe or it's a compromised version of calc.exe. And since I happen to be familiar with Meterpreter, I know this command called get system. And so that's a pretty dead giveaway. So this is a strong indicator of compromise. This is not something that should normally be in calculator.exe. Even if I were to be mean and put this in explorer.exe for the sake of example, why would explorer.exe need get system or get SAM hashes? Even get SAM hashes seems totally irrelevant. Maybe in some weird implementation of explorer.exe, it needs system access to do something. But that's why the NTDLL and Win32 API exists. So that to handle sensitive kernel level functions, you pass it through this user land API that passes along to the Win32 API that runs at system level, at kernel level. So to bypass that seems completely against the entire design principles of Microsoft's operating system. So that in itself, if you happen to understand that, it's one of the first things that I taught, you probably recognize, hey, this is wrong. This shouldn't exist. And it just so happens that there's no actually API call to call this. So what this turns out to be is, so since we've studied Meterpreter, the first thing Meterpreter does is it loads, basically, once the established core, starts injecting DLLs on the client side to establish the functionality. It does everything through reflective DLL injection. And so the first DLL it loads is its standard API. And in that standard API are commands like get system and get same hashes. So and it loads that standard API 100% of the time. It may not load anything else, but that itself is a sufficient indicator that, hey, something's going wrong, and this is actually probably my interpreter session. So this is not just malware. So I discussed this with some of my friends, and well, let's get to the slide. Given these two strings, you can write a signature to detect this running in memory. However, you have to have the ability to basically scan the entire process image, which is time intensive. But AVs do this, and host-based intrusion detection systems do this, and perhaps a custom RAT. Everyone know what a RAT is? I haven't talked about it. No one. Good. Okay. It stands for Remote Administration Tool. It's just something common with system administration. I'm not going to really test on it. So RATs are basically something used by system administrators to poke around in the system that they've just customly written. Or perhaps it's an open source one. So to demonstrate that you can write a signature for this, there's a rule language called Yara, and it's based off generally C structs. And so I have an example Yara rule below that will detect Meterpreter in memory. You could use this on a host-based intrusion detection system, and it will detect any active Meterpreter sessions as long as it manages to scan it. So let's talk about Meterpreter. Say you have an exploit, you send it over the wire, you send it on an open port, the firewall lets it through, you have the packet's payload, basically the application data you're sending is encoded to get past the firewall, the intrusion detection system, get past the web application firewall. Everyone with me? So at the point where it actually hits the vulnerable system and starts executing, perhaps it starts decoding itself to get around the problems of bad bytes and null bytes. And then at the end of that, you perhaps have raw opcodes right there. Even if you have further encoding at that point, like Shikata Guy 9 or something else being active, if that function gets run and decodes itself, at that state, it will be decoded in memory. So if you have these strings like this somewhere in that payload, it will be visible at that time. I'm going to talk at the end of it how you would improve Meterpreter to basically make this more or less undetectable. So you could use this rule to detect Meterpreter sessions, just based off the printable strings in the process image. There's other ways you could do it. You could find specific opcode series to Meterpreter. Say some of the opcodes in one of the main functions in the standard API DLL, or in the core system itself, and use those to build basically detection rules so that you can act on Meterpreter events or Meterpreter-related intrusions. So before deploying any new rule to antivirus or intrusion detection system, it's essential that you do some testing first, because these things are heuristics, and statistically they can encounter false positives and false negatives. So you want to make sure that, hey, this actually detects this. You could do it through Volatility itself. It supports something called YARA scan. So it will scan the memory image you've given it, which is exactly the same as any AV scanning the full memory of a given system for it, for anything that matches these YARA rules. And you can see it's basically A equals priv escalate get system, B equals priv get same hashes, and the condition is that A and B are both present. It's really straightforward. And so if that rule is matched, YARA scan will return true. This matches. And so that's a good test. And also return any details. This is the PID it matches. Now, if it happens to match something else, say instead of naming these things priv escalate get system, priv password get same hashes, they named it something clever. And they still wanted to keep, printable strings. They just wanted to get around this whole problem by naming it something that's common somewhere else. You can see how false positives would come back. Like if they made A be username and B be password, and that's just their functions to own shit, you can see how this would generate false positives, which is why you would perhaps need to go to another route for writing signatures, specifically going for matching hexadecimal bytes, looking for the specific opcodes. So if all is good, perhaps you establish a whitelist and say smss.exe actually has this also. And so your condition would thus be adapted that A and B are present and is also not smss.exe. And it would be that simple. So then you would update basically the host and intrusion detection systems across the network with this, or the AV if they're compatible with this rule, and then have it act with have it specified to act with kill any matching process that matches this rule. And then all interpreter sessions in the network will hopefully be killed. And it's really that simple sometimes. Obviously, it depends on whether or not your systems support YARA rules. Also, a side note. So we see priv escalate get system and priv escalate get same hashes. These actually don't by themselves indicate that the attacker has attempted to get system or to steal the same hashes. So you have to do further analysis to actually determine that. So analysis would be like looking at the handles for open files to see anything related to the SAM hashes, like looking at see if LSAS, perhaps the process has an open handle that something is actually scanning through the process memory for LSAS.exe, or something is actually has system access and has opened SAM, the SAM file itself. There's an open file handle there. And so there's a plugin in Volatility that I think I skipped over called Handles. And it's just like LSOF with Linux. And that's basically LS for all the open file descriptors. So discovering those would obviously require more investigation. So like I said, alternate rules for YARA or other signatures usually involve the capability to search for hexadecimal strings along with wildcards. And wildcards could just be a question mark, and they would just be filled in by anything. It's pretty simple regular expression matching. So there are some things that use YARA. I use it because it's easy to understand, and thus it's easy to teach. So these vendors use it. Volatility also uses it, thanks to a community plugin. Whoever wrote that is awesome. And FireEye and ClamAV, these vendors / products, are the only ones that I know of that happen to be host-based intrusion detection systems and antivirus. ClamAV is Linux only, as far as I know. And FireEye, you have to pay for. And they support YARA rules. Now, if you had a different intrusion detection system that you could write rules for, obviously you'd have to write it in whichever language is supported. I simply use YARA because it's easy. So we've detected that calc.exe is currently hosting an interpreter session, and we're able to find, just by looking at the strings, which is a lucky find in itself, that there's some suspicious activity going on. Even if we didn't know as an interpreter and didn't have this inside knowledge, we could recognize, if we're careful, that why does calculator have get system and get string attachments? So you could build a YARA rule just off that knowledge, and then use YARA scan to automate detection of whatever memory dumps you had across the network. Perhaps you're just doing one thing at a time. Once you establish a rule, you can use that rule on all the other memory dumps you have to speed up analysis. Find out what other processes across machines the attacker is potentially compromised at that time. And that is a wonderful way to help you identify the scope of the attack. So, in responding to it, we want to identify where the attacker is coming from and identify whether the attacker compromised the system token. If he did, there's a higher chance of him having the ability to establish a rootkit, and that is a pain. So, using Volatility's plugin API hooks, it looks through any processes and finds instances where the API tables have been hooked. In other words, they've been modified to point to perhaps attacker code that does some stuff and then jumps somewhere else, perhaps back to the original function. And so the results tell us that SVC hosts has some API hooks in it, that foxitreader.exe has API hooks in it, and Windows Update, basically Windows Auto Update Control has exe hooks in it. So breaking these down, svchost.exe is something that you'll often find dozens of things running, and dozen versions of it running at the same time. Is also running with system privilege. So if something running a system has API hooks present in it, something had access to edit it. Usually that means something already had a system token access or exploited some vulnerability in SVC host or some unknown vulnerability to obtain that privilege. So that's a strong indicator of compromise for compromise of the system token. Also, the presence of API hooks in Foxit Reader indicate that perhaps was the initial vector. So this could all possibly be some malicious PDF hitting your network. And Windows Update Auto Control is a user level process. It may have also been infected. I don't know. So, using ConScan, which on my system took 25 minutes to run. Yeah, this is why I'm not going to do this for you in class. I don't want to put you all asleep. It shows 4 connections are currently open, but there's only 2 IP addresses really being used. One is the gateway, and one is 192.168.1.161. I didn't have time to make it some foreign IP address to make this all, more realistic. But also, I should note that when dealing with this at a realistic level, you should expect to see this being a really populated table. But at least it shows you IP addresses to start with. And you can start doing whois requests and see what's the legitimate service, perhaps 74.whatever, this is Google, and so on and so on. And you can identify perhaps Tor exit nodes or proxies. Or anonymous VPN services that are being used. Then with that information, you can update the firewall to, if you really want to perhaps just drop all connections being initiated to or from that IP address. So, since we're basically out of time, I demonstrated how we use volatility and IDA to find basically the backdoor just with malfind. We got a little bit lucky. I didn't show you going through all the process dumps with IDA. Showed you the compromise process. We found the attacker's IP, and we have a strong indicator the attack vector was a Foxit Reader exploit. and also indicated that the system token was compromised from the API hooks. And this was all without using any disk forensic evidence. So someone could realistically have an entire semester-long course in this stuff. So, however, hopefully, given all the information on offensive stuff I've presented to you thus far through the semester, you kind of have an ability to pick this up pretty easily and at least be able to follow along with what I've been saying. So, yeah, I kind of already talked about Vol Shell. Any questions? Yes.
If there's a rootkit on the system, will there be evidence of that on the disk? Hard disk?
Probably yes. Unless it's a ring -1 or ring -2 rootkit, in which case it could infect things like the certain parts of the BIOS. There's been rootkit proof of concepts that write themselves to MacBook batteries. Charlie Miller, I believe, reverse engineered the whole API with which basically the MacBook figures out how much charge is left on the battery, tells it what time it is, and makes the clock run and keeps the clock synchronized. And there's basically this I/O communication going on with the battery, and there's some buffer overflows on the battery's firmware, and he basically used that to write his rootkit to the battery, and you have to buy a new battery, and that's the most expensive part of the MacBook. So, no, rootkits could be beyond the disk. Good question. Any other questions?